Now available for VOD, it is Watchmen Chapter 1, which is an adaptation of Alan Moore's graphic novel Watchmen. I love this graphic novel. I love this comic. It is one of the best pieces of literature that I have ever read. I think this thing is incredible. A lot of people hold this deal so dear that a few years ago, Zack Snyder directed Watchmen Director's Cut. I actually like this movie. There's been an HBO kind of sequel. There's been other attempts to bring Watchmen to life in animated form. This one is made by the team over at Warner Brothers, DC. This is essentially an adaptation of Watchmen. It's a very straightforward adaptation of it. I was excited to hear this. I thought it'd be cool to just kind of get the most pure representation of Watchmen done to a film and get some talented voice actors in here. Katie Sackhoff is a notable name in this. You all know the story of Watchmen at this point. In 1985, the murder of a government-sponsored superhero draws his outlawed colleagues out of retirement and into a mystery that threatens to upend their personal lives and the world itself. That is the premise of Watchmen Chapter 1. This really covers about half of this graphic novel. Spoiler alert, but just kind of give you a framework. Watchmen Chapter 1 basically gets us from the beginning to Rorschach's arrest. That is essentially what this movie spans. It is an hour and 23 minutes. Let's kind of start this because I did not like this movie. I actually found it to be quite poor. The reason I found it to be quite bad, frankly, is I didn't understand the purpose of this. And let me explain it, because I laid out the purpose of this movie earlier. It is supposed to be an adaptation of Watchmen. Like, it is supposed to bring this, to an animated form and tell that story. Reason I didn't like it is because I didn't actually understand the exercise and point of doing it this way. And the reason is because of this film right here, Watchmen, the Director's Cut. I think this movie is a very faithful adaptation in visual style and doesn't get into the depth of Alan Moore's graphic novel. If you just want the look of Watchmen and seeing those iconic scenes recreated, this movie's very serviceable in that regard. If you want the emotional depth, the intellectual challenging ideas that Alan Moore has with Watchmen, well, Watchmen Chapter 1 doesn't really deliver that. And the reason it doesn't deliver it is that runtime, 83 minutes. And it's actually not 83 minutes. It's like 78 minutes with credits. And so when you add that up, 80 minutes plus 80 minutes, you're now at like 160 minutes. And just for reference, the director's cut of Watchmen by Zack Snyder is 186 minutes. This movie is presumably longer than both Watchmen Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 is, assuming that Chapter 2 keeps about the same length that the first installment of this one does. That's a fundamental problem with retelling the story, because while rewatching it, I felt that I got a lot of the really famous panels from this. I'm going to pull up a random page, and it's a really useful one because this one is in it. It is the frame of Dr. Manhattan on Mars. This literal frame is recreated in Watchmen Chapter 1. And it's also recreated in Zack Snyder's Watchmen. Most of this movie is just recreation of a lot of these visual frames. A lot of it is in here. This scene with Night Owl and the comedian recreated in this movie. It is a recreation, but it's 70 minutes. It's not a particularly in-depth story. So when I'm watching it, I'm like, well, why aren't I just watching this movie that I think is pretty good and is essentially the same thing? I really don't understand the difference between Watchmen Chapter 1 and Zack Snyder's Watchmen. I think they're basically the same movie done animated. And my issue with that is I just think everything in Watchmen Chapter 1 is just slightly weaker. I don't think many of the performances / voice actor performances in this movie are good. And maybe it's because I'm now basing some of this on what I liked about Zack Snyder's adaptation of Watchmen. But for instance, I think Jackie Earle Haley is really good as Rorschach in Zack Snyder's adaptation. But the issue then is I watch Chapter 1 and I'm like, well, I don't really care about the guy who does Rorschach. I don't care for his voice.
October 13th, 1985. On Friday night, a comedian died in New York.
I don't care for the guy who does Dr. Manhattan. I think the guy who plays Night Owl is good. I think the guy who plays Ozymandias is the standout. I think the vocal actor who does Ozymandias in Chapter 1 is by far the best of the voice actor. And I think Katie Sackhoff is an improvement as Silk Spectra. So there are vocal performances that I like in this movie, but it's not enough to make it feel different textually. And again, it's the run length. By the end of this, I'm like, okay, this is the exact same adaptation, just told through an animated lens. And if you're going to essentially try to redo the Watchmen story, why not make it more in depth? And they try to. They try to make Watchmen more in depth. Specifically, this movie really does incorporate more elements of the Tales of the Black Freighter. Now, to be honest, the issue with this is I think the pirate stuff in the Watchmen comic book, the Tales of the Black Freighter, is kind of the worst part of this graphic novel. It's always the part I kind of just skip over. I understand it as a metaphorical level to incorporate it, to bring it in. In a movie, I think it just kills all momentum. And thus, I'm watching this 78-minute movie that just feels exactly like this movie, just done worse. So I'm like, why aren't I watching this movie, which is already highly criticized? I know people don't love it. Again, I love this movie. I think it's really good. And I'm just like, I don't understand the purpose of this. Like, if you're going to retell Watchmen, if you're going to do this, do it right. Like, really get into the emotional depth, the intelligence, the big ideas that you're really trying to work through. Don't just skim over the surface. And Watchmen Chapter 1 is a skim over the surface. We got a lot of ground to cover. Buckle up. And I'm like, no, like, actually, like, let's spend some time in this world. Like, go slower. Make this a part 1, make this a part 2, make this a part 3, make this a TV show, like a limited series. Like, I don't really care, but if you're going to reinvent, if you're going to bring this back, do something interesting with it. And don't just do a straight adaptation, because I've seen the straight adaptation. I've seen Zack Snyder's Watchmen. This is the straight adaptation. Like, you do get the story of Watchmen largely. There's obviously some things specifically near the end of this film that Zack Snyder changes. I actually think it's for the better. But like, so like, I just didn't understand the purpose of this. On top of that, the animation just doesn't look particularly good in Watchmen Chapter 1. I just thought it was a little bit under animated. It kind of feels like, and maybe this is just the issue with DC not really giving a huge budget to these movies. I thought the budget of this movie didn't look good. And the way I can note that is I just didn't think the animation was all that up to par. I think some of it looks good. I think some of the characterization is good. I think a lot of the world feels very bland and boring, and you've seen it in other animated, like, of these superhero films. It just kind of feels recycled, maybe different colors used, but you've seen it. It didn't feel like an exciting way to tell this story. Again, some of it's recreation, but that's also an issue where I'm just like, when you're recreating something, specifically when you are trying to model it so much after artwork made famous by this graphic novel, you now find yourself in an even more challenging part, because when you adapt it into live action, there are just natural changes you have to make. There's different types of lighting. There's different kind of costumes. There's work that goes into that, framing, all of that. When you're adapting it into an animated form, you can essentially get any single frame to look like this. Any frame in an animation, you can get the colors to work like that. That's not a fair criticism necessarily, but it is a legitimate one. And I understand it's actually much harder to do that. This is much harder said than done. And the art of essentially replication is a really lengthy and tremendous process. So I don't want to insult the animators or the art stylists, people behind who worked on this movie, but it is kind of the issue where I'm just like, okay, if you're doing this and this is the style that you're approaching in it, and it's supposed to replicate this, the comic, why aren't I just reading the comic? Why aren't I just reading the graphic novel? And that was my reaction watching Watchmen Chapter 1, whereas I'm just like, okay, I'd rather just watch the live action version, or if I just wanted the straight through story of Watchmen, this is the better way to consume this. It's not that it's bad. Like, if this is your first introduction to Watchmen, you're probably going to really like what this film achieves at times. But if it's not, like, if you've seen Watchmen before, like I have, if you've consumed Watchmen, if you know the story really well, I just don't think it's that exciting of a adaptation. I don't think it does anything. I don't necessarily think it, like, takes away anything special of Watchmen, but it doesn't do anything new with Watchmen. It doesn't make it to feel exciting. It doesn't adapt it in any way that is so exciting. You've seen this adaptation before because this movie exists, and what you want to see, just read this. It's the struggle. And again, I think it is just all comes back to this idea, and I know I'm repeating myself. I do apologize, but it all comes down to the idea of you decided to make this a 78-minute movie for part 1. And unless part 2 is like 3 hours, which I don't think it is, I bet it's going to be 90 minutes or less. Like, you've just made Watchmen again, but even shorter than what Zack Snyder did. So what's the point? Like, what is the point? This one was criticized for not taking the source material kind of face on and making changes and not being as in-depth, like not having the nuance of Alan Moore's Watchmen. So your solution to that is take this movie, but do less? I don't know. It's really weird. I thought it was really weird. And maybe people are listening to this review and they're like, this is a good adaptation. I like this. I like seeing this world. Great. I'm glad you had fun with it. I didn't. I just didn't see the point in this movie. And that's my review. I didn't get it. I didn't understand the intellectual thought that went into this movie. And honestly, if they just made this a 2-hour part 1 and a 2-hour part 2, I'd be way more involved. Like I'd be more interested because I'm like, oh, okay, they are going a little bit more than surface level. I still don't think a 4-hour adaptation of Watchmen would still be close to covering anything that all the ideas that Alan Moore presents in Watchmen, but at least it does a better job at tackling it. Watchmen Chapter 1, not impressed. Maybe part 2 will impress me more. We'll see it when it comes out. But 1.5 out of 5 stars, really just... If you had the choice, this is an endorsement. Just read the graphic novel. This thing's fantastic. That's the way you should consume this. And I can recommend this one. I like this one. And honestly, if it's between watching Chapter 1 or watching Zack Snyder's Watchmen, I think this one actually wins. I think this is the better adaptations thus far. So anyway, thank you all for watching. If you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more. My name is Ben Friedman. Take care.